In this one, we'll try to understand some of the basics of neural network. What's the motivation, like from where the intuition is coming. So if we have like neurons in our brain, and this is the structure of a neuron, and we don't have to fully understand this. I will just try to explain like what is our understanding of these neurons in our brain. So we have this like cell region. Okay, so this is called the nucleus, or also the cell body. And then we have a lot of like these arms kind of thing. So these are called terminals. So we have synapses here, and then we have dendrites. Okay, and then we have this axon. So we are interested in these four elements from the neurons at this point: the cell body, the dendrites arm, the axon, and the synapses. Okay, so what happens is your neurons take activations or some kind of like neural activity, you can say, or some signal, and it flows through the dendrites, and it goes through your nucleus, and there is like some kind of operation which happens, some kind of mathematical operation, you can say, which we truly don't understand, but it can be approximated using, let's say, averaging or summing. So in a way, this cell is actually, or this neuron is getting a lot of signals from all these dendrites, right, as input. And then there is some function which takes all these input signals and do some mathematical operation. Let's assume that's just averaging. So it will average all those activations, and then that activation is actually flowed through this axon. And what will happen if we receive like a very high activation function, or you can say like a very strong signal from these dendrites, then the signal will flow, and then it will be passed to a different cell or a different neuron. And this happens like through this synapses. Okay, and if the activation is not high, I mean it's very weak, then it won't pass through, or it won't flow through this axon. So that's like a very basic operation which happens in our neurons, and that's the basic intuition of neural network as well. Okay, so the brain is composed of like several neurons, and as I said, like they receive input from the dendrites, these arms over here, and approximately it's like summed at this region. And if it exceeds like some kind of threshold, then it will pass to the next set. Otherwise, there will be no neural activity. Now, those were like let's say biological models. And if we try to connect multiple neurons, and what we try to do is we try to create artificial models, and we try to connect these neurons together. We try to build these neural nets. So this is kind of a simulation kind of environment, and this is like also called a artificial system. Okay, and the idea is, with this very simple operation where the neuron is actually taking signal from like multiple locations and performing very simple operation, and then deciding whether to pass forward this signal or not, this simple operation can actually help you build very, very sophisticated computational models. And that's how you build your neural networks. Okay? And the idea is to approximate human brain, but again, that's a goal. I mean, we are not anywhere close to that. So let's try to compare like some of the statistics from human brain and the computer we have. And some of these might have changed today because the field is progressing so fast. But of course, like from the left column, like the properties of the brain, it won't change. It won't change because it's based on like our understanding of our brain. So we roughly have 200 billion neurons and 32 trillion synapses. And comparing that with a computer system, your neurons is like same as the RAM you have, all right, which actually used to perform processing or any kind of computation. And 1 billion is like roughly a number. I mean, it can be much higher or much smaller depending upon what kind of device you have. And you can have trillions of bytes of disk space where you store your information. Okay. Computing, like the energy use, brain, it's assumed to be like around 25 watt, and energy watt, again, it depends on what kind of system you have. It could be anywhere from 30 watts to 90 watts. In terms of processing speed in brain, based on like an understanding, it's roughly 100 hertz. But the computers mean they are much, much faster. Okay. And this is a very interesting aspect. Our brain, it can actually work in parallel, distributed, and again, we know like the female part, like it's actually very efficient in performing multiple tasks at the same time. And based on my personal experience, I have seen that a lot. And males, like the male counterparts, it's not that easy. I mean, usually we focus on one thing and then we don't know what's happening in our surroundings. On the other hand, computers, like it's always serial, it's centralized system. There is one system which actually which tries to control everything. Okay, so it's not distributed or parallel. Brain is like fault tolerant, and if something goes wrong, I mean, we can still handle it. Okay, we can easily do the damage control, but in case of computers, it's very hard to make them fault tolerant. Brain, of course, we know it learns. It has some kind of learning capability. Computers, we are still like going in that direction, but we can't really say that it's learning or what exactly is happening. Okay, so we have intelligence. The brain is actually conscious. Computers, no. Some might argue, but still, from my personal experience, what I have seen, we are still far away from this intelligence and conscious. Okay, so let's try to understand, given that structure of neuron, which comes from like a brain, how we can compute like this kind of operation mathematically, and that will be the foundation of your neural network. Okay, so this is the neural structure which we just discussed. That's the cell, the nuclei, and these are the dendrites from where the signals are actually flowing in and going through the axon. And depending upon whether the strength is sufficient or not, it will flow out through the axons to the next neuron. Now, what we can do is we can take these as parameters, like as input data points, right? Let's say we have x1 to xn different input signals. And corresponding to each input signal, we have some kind of weight. And that weight is represented by, let's say, this arrow over here, right? And then as an operation, what we try to do is we try to sum all these signals using these weights. Now, if you remember from like the concept of linear combination, what exactly we are trying to do is we are taking a linear combination of these input signals using these weights. So each of this weight will be multiplied with the signal and will be added to the weighted multiplication of the next signal, right? And whatever output we get, then we try to test whether this is like sufficient or not. If it's sufficient, it will pass. If not, it won't pass. Okay, so let's try to understand how we can write this in a mathematical formulation. So if your input is like going from xi to xn, and this wij is like your weight for each of these input signal, then this is kind of a weighting of one signal, and then if you add like this summation point here, this is the weighted average of all the data points, and that's going to give you this activation value. Okay, so this is again you might have understood, this is just like a linear combination of all these signals. Okay, so it's very important to understand here, x is the signal. Okay, so the signal will vary from image to image. It will depend upon what your input is. On the other hand, these weights are independent of your input. These weights are the property of your cell or your nuclei. All right, and these weights are something which we try to learn. So this process is going to give this activation, and to figure out whether like this is strong enough or not, we try to use activation function. Of course, there are other motivation to use activation function. We'll talk about that as well. So for example, like sigmoid function, this is one activation function. That's a simple equation. And this activation value will go through this function. You can just put it here. And whatever the output is, that is going to be the output of this particular neuron, okay, which will go to the next neuron. So again, just to recap, these are input signals. These are the weights independent of your input signal. These are property of your nuclei, or you can say, I mean, if you're trying to learn a model, these are property of your model. Okay, so you are not learning these input values, you are learning these weights. These input values will change with your sample. And then you have some kind of operation, which is linear combination of these signals. And this is your activation function. and the output going to the next cell. Okay, so this basic building block which I showed you, this is called a perceptron, and this was invented like way back in 1957, and it can be used to perform a simple task like linear classification. All right, and the weights which I was showing you, you can represent that as a vector, and we also need a bias. I will talk about like why we need bias later, but we do need a bias, and the idea is, so this is like the basic building block of your perceptron. And again, these are your input signals. This is your neuron or your perceptron, which will have these values. So you know, like these all three weights, which you will use to actually find the importance of these signals. So in addition to this, you also have a bias. Okay, and bias solves like many purposes. One simple intuition is your input signal might be coming from different ranges, right? So depending upon that, you need like some bias term so that if some of your signals are getting filtered out, you don't want that. Okay, so you're just trying to add like that value to your signal. So which means to say that, okay, for your input signal, whatever it is, your activation will be at least this amount. Okay, so it's kind of a starting point for your signals. So that's one interpretation. Of course, there are a lot of others, and as we will move forward in the course, we will see like how this is used. And to be frank, I mean, even if you don't use it, we have seen it doesn't matter. But again, don't try to like worry about it like what that means, but just to give you an idea. Okay, but initially when these were proposed, we had these biases. Okay, so if you want to represent this as in a mathematical term, what you can do is you can represent like these weights as a vector, right? And B is just a number, it's a bias term. And this operation over here, this is you can say like a dot product between this weight vector and the input vector. And I guess this input vector is like set of these values. All right, and you know that from the basics which we have covered in linear algebra, this dot product is going to give you just like element-wise multiplication of x1, w1, x2, w2, right? And you just sum those up. And at the end, you will add this bias. And what you're going to do is, if this value over here, whatever this mathematical formulation is, if it's negative, you say the signal is very weak. And if it's positive, you say, okay, the signal is strong, and you will pass through. Okay, so that's one way. The other way you can say is that if the output of this formulation is negative, and you are trying to use this perceptron to solve, let's say, image classification, which says whether object is present or not, then you can interpret in that way. You can say that, okay, if it's negative, object is not present, and if it's positive, object is present. So that way you can use like this simple formulation to solve your classification task. All right, and of course you can just so this is dot product again, as I said, linear combination of different input signals. Now, to use this, let's take a simple example. Let's say we have an image of resolution 28x28, and this is a grayscale image. Now, what we can do is we can convert it to a vector. So in total, we'll have like 784 different elements or 784 different pixels. And let's say that's our input vector. So it will have like this dimension, and this represents X, which means that this is pixel level representation, which we were discussing earlier. All right. So your input vector X now has 784 different values. Now, in your neuron, then you need like weight for each of this input signal, right? So if you represent that neuron as W, which again will be a vector of weights, then it should have 784 different weights. And again, you can represent that as a matrix, or you can say like a single vector, right? And B is like a bias. So biases, usually you will have one bias for each perceptron. Okay. Now, what you can do is, as we saw in the previous slide, you just take dot product of X and W and add the bias. Okay. And if you do the math here for the shape of like this operation, this is the dimension of X, this is the dimension of Y. So this is going to give you just one number, right? That will be 1 cross 1, and we just add the bias. So essentially you can represent this perceptron using this simple equation. And this is kind of parametric because X could be like of any dimension, and depending upon that, you will have dimension set for W. Okay, so this simple equation tells you how a simple perceptron will work. So of course, that was like, let's say a binary classifier, which was saying whether object is present or not. What if you have a set of classes, right? You can have 3 different classes. Now, what you can do is for each class, you can add a neuron. Okay, so let's say this is your input vector. You have 3 different values here. And for each class, you have this perceptron now. And each perceptron will tell you whether that class is present or not. So then you can solve like your multiclass classification problem. The operations won't change. But the only thing is for each perceptron, you will have that many parameters, right? All the arrows coming in. Because for each perceptron, you're going to take linear combination of your inputs. And for each neuron perceptron over here, you will have different set of weights. So those weights are not sharing. Okay, so let's try to understand how that will change the mathematical formulation. Your input vector is not going to change. It will still be 1 cross 784. Your weight matrix will change. Earlier, you had just one perceptron. So you needed like just 784 different values. But let's say you are solving a 10 class classification problem, which means you have 10 different object categories. For that, you will need 10 different perceptrons. So which means the number of parameters you need is 784 times 10. Okay, so 1 for each perceptron. So again, you can represent that as a matrix. And if you'll try to follow, again, for each perceptron, you will have a bias. So in this case, you have 10 perceptrons that will give you 10 different biases. So bias, again, you can represent as a vector 1 cross 10. And your equation will not change. It will still be X times W plus B. In this case, your W is not like a vector, it's a matrix. But again, if you do the math and if you remember like how we did matrix multiplication, this is again going to give you 10 different numbers. All right. So at the end, you will get 10 values, and each value will represent one class. So in this case, one thing which is important is this is not your network parameter. This is input. These are your network parameters. Okay, so these W matrices, which are storing weights, which are actually which you are using to compute the linear combination. Those are the parameters which are actually learned when you train your model. We can simplify it further. So here it's a little, not complicated, but just from like computation convenience. Let's say we don't want to perform any addition. So what we can do is, and it's just a hack, you don't have to do this. So what you can do is you can move the bias inside your weights, right? And then you can add one more input and you can hard code that as 1. Now what will happen is if this B is the bias, it will be multiplied by 1, right? So it will still be B, but now you can represent that as a parameter in your network, which is your weight. And then your operation is simplified. You don't need any summation because you don't have like B outside of your matrix multiplication. Now that was like just clubbing different perceptrons together. But of course, what you can do is you can perform composition of these different set of perceptrons. And each set is called a layer. In this case, let's say you have this as input, and this is your input layer. You have 3 perceptrons here. And what you can do is whatever output you get from these perceptrons, you can add one more layer of these perceptrons. In this case, you have 4. And then you can have like your final output layer, which is just one neuron, which means you're just trying to solve binary classification. Okay, so you can make like these networks deeper and deeper. And the idea is like you want to represent complex functions using composition of smaller functions. Okay, again, to note that these are your input. Weights are actually these arrows, which are going from, which are transforming your input layer by layer. And the number of weights you have will depend upon these neurons. Okay, so in this simple network, if you have to count the number of parameters, then you just count these edges, because those are the weights of your network. So in this case, this is layer 1, this is layer 2, this is layer 3, which is again the output layer as well. Okay, this is sometimes called hidden layer. Again, this is hidden layer 2. You can also call this input layer. Then your final layer, this is also called output layer. And essentially, all of these operations, as we discussed earlier, it's just matrix multiplication, which makes it very efficient. And we use like GPUs to train these models. And GPUs, like we have very, very efficient matrix multiplication operations. And that's why training these models is easier in GPUs. Okay, and these matrices are actually the weights of your network, as I said earlier.